Chevreuse, in my opinion, represents a big problem and the potential of Genshin's 4 stars. Right off the bat, I want to say I don't have a problem with Chevreuse herself. I like her design, it's fine. And while I personally hate some of her idols, specifically any of the noisy idols, I just hate them for any character that eats or drinks during their idol animation. I still think that overall as a character, she's at least interesting. And I think that's more that can be said than most characters. And I think that is more than what can be said for the vast majority of newer 4 stars. Looking at the character roster here, we've had a lot of 4-star characters be released, but the primary best ones have always been since launch. Bennett, Xiangling, Xingqiu, Fischl, and even if we're extending this onwards, Diona. At best, the notable 4-star characters have been Kujosara, Goro, Yunjin, Kugi Shinobu, and most of these characters suffer from the specific use case scenario in that they're only good either with one specific unit or in specific team comps. Now, obviously, Kujosara was the start of this, the nice 60% crit damage bonus you get for having a Electro character, or specifically once you get to C6. Now, obviously, Kujosara was the start of this. At C6, she gives you a bunch of crit damage for your Electro units. That's why she's useful for Ride and Hyper Carry teams. And Goro has the opposite effect where, yeah, it's good for Geo teams, but the vast majority of the time, you aren't running Geo characters because even the most recently released Geo unit, Navia, doesn't incentivize running her with other Geos. Unless it is somebody like Zhongli for the protective units or for his crystallization near his pillars, or just Albedo for easier crystallization. Ignoring that, we've had a bunch of, at least in my opinion, lackluster 4-stars. And I'm not saying they're god-awful characters, what I am instead saying is that these characters have no real use case scenario outside of a very few specific and niche teams. How many of you actually use Dori? And I don't mean use her just because she's a character you like, because you can do that for anybody on this list. I mean use her because she is a good character in terms of what she offers your teams. How many of you use Candice, Layla, Kaveh, Mika, even Lynette, and Charlotte? These are units who, yeah, can do their jobs good enough. But I think that the bigger issue is that the standard units, the big 4, are so powerful that it's incredibly difficult to in any way, shape, or form move past them. Yeah, you can say, I don't want to use Bennett, and instead use a Diona, use a Sayu, for example. That's perfectly fine. But I think that if these standard 4 can't be nerfed, and they can't, then instead, why not make them be the standard for what a 4-star unit should be, instead of the exception to the rule of what a 4-star is? Because every new 4-star that has to contend with the buffing capabilities of Bennett or the off-field damage capabilities of either one of these 3 characters is going to look poor by comparison. And even if we're going into new and more recent, at least interesting units, Fremy and Lynette were interesting because they had Uxia alignments at the very least. And this was something we didn't really have an abundance of because, you know, we just got to Fontaine. But outside of that, in terms of what they offer you, Lynette doesn't excel in any specific category as an Anemo character. She's not a buffer like Faruzan. She's not an individual unit to provide you with heals like a Sayu or a Jean. And she doesn't have crowd control that's really useful, at least or on par with somebody like Sucrose. And I do think this is a bit of a bad thing, because I do think the legitimate question you'd have to ask yourself in regards to newer 4-star characters is, are they worth investing into? Because the resources you put into building up a Charlotte, a Kirara, a Kaveh, or a Yao Yao could instead be spent buffing up your already good characters, whether they be 5 stars or 4 stars. And by that metric, why not just invest into better and more well-rounded 4-star characters? Like a Diona, like a Beidou, because on the off chance you do use them, they're going to excel in what they're supposed to do. In many situations, we had the release of characters like Goro, who were good for Geo units, but we then didn't get any Geo units to help him. And so he fell off because unless you're using Ito, you have no real reason to use this man. Yunjin buffs normal attacks, but how many of you are legitimately using that outside of the few Yoimiya mains? And I'm not saying she's a bad buffer for Mia. What I am saying though is, prior to C6, or at least prior to a few constellations, she's not necessarily a larger upgrade over Bennett. And that's fine. Sure, I understand. She is at least a side grade or alternative to Bennett, but my question at that point is, why does it take constellations to reach that point? Bennett at C0, or especially at C1 and above, is an exceptional unit. I don't think 4-star characters should be instead locked behind the concept of them eventually getting constellations to make them greater. Yunjin being a character who is exceptional at C0, but then gets constellations that dramatically improve her own abilities or the buffing capabilities of her kit is fine. But the fact of the matter is, for the individual who she was meant to buff up, that being Yoimiya, she wasn't a good upgrade until you had cons on her. And given the rarity of Yunjin on banners, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Now we're seeing the release of units like Chevreuse. Units who can buff specific reactions. And the only other character who at least is vaguely similar to this is Nilou. And I do think Chevreuse does Nilou's, at least intention, better than her. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think anyone's going to defute the fact that Nilou's super blooms are expanded. What's the actual name for them? Nilou's bountiful cores are good. They're extremely good. They're extremely powerful. But I think the biggest drawback is that your team had to consist of only Dendro and Hydro to get any of the buffing potential of her kits. Chevreuse as a character, despite being a 4-star, does do her job well. She buffs them when all party members are Pyro and Electro, but she can still heal, and she can still, to a degree at least, buff you regardless. She's going to heal you. She maybe won't buff your characters, but she's buffing nearby Pyro and Electro characters. It's not a system, it's not a requirement to only have Pyro and Electro characters. This means that she does at least work in other teams, not necessarily as an upgrade, but as a side grade and a viable unit to work with. I don't mind this. But then my question is, for all the individuals who have set teams, maybe you run Xiao, maybe you're running a Vape team or a Melt team, or whatever the case may be, the more specific a character's goal is, if your goal is only to buff Melt reactions, if your goal is only to buff Anemo damage when it's fused with Geo or crystallized, whatever the case may be, then at that point you have to be either extremely good in that regard, or it's just not worth it. Bluntly speaking, Mika was meant to buff physical damage, but I don't think many of you are actively going to ever use Mika. Yeah, he's a good healer, and yeah, with Constellations he becomes pretty fine, but we didn't get many physical units. We had Eula for ages, and then the only recent update to physical we realistically had was Fremi. Whether you use him or not, I do think it's still an issue in that a character's, or specifically a 4-star's value, is solely dependent on the niche they intend to buff. If Goro buffed Vaporize reaction, he'd be a lot more popular with characters like Hu Tao, Yoimiya, Diluc, anyone, even a Vape Bennett. But as it stands, buffing Geo reactions, or buffing only physical reactions, is incredibly difficult when we don't have these characters to make them excel in that regard. Similar to how, I'm pretty sure at least a few of you older players remember, Kuki Shinobu was god-awful because she didn't really have a job when she released. I don't think it's fair that she was bad and then got good later on. I think she should have just been released with Dendro because it made no sense to release a 4-star that you could have been excited about, but who didn't really have a role until like a year later on. But besides that point, we are in a position right now to where I don't think there's enough value offered by newer 4-star units to make them worth investing into unless they're hot. Lynette is cute, I like her a lot. But bluntly speaking, I would rather use any other Anemo character over her. Mika is cute. His English VA is depressing. But how many of you legitimately ever going to use him? Even as somebody who likes to use characters like Razor and Fremi, I don't find many scenarios in which I'd use Mika. Now don't get me wrong, I like Mika's kit better than I like Bennett's because I don't like using Bennett's burst in Overworld, and Mika is a bit more flexible with that buffing capability, but it's still not necessarily a fair comparison. Not many people use Kiara. Not many people use Kale. Layla, Charlotte, Dory, Kaveh, and Candace don't really have situations in which they are really good at, or at least excelling in. They are fine, but I think especially with Constellations, they shouldn't just be a fine option. The potential for a 4-star to not come home is something I think all of us recognize. At the very least, it's something you might be acquainted with if you tried to pull it from maybe a Kujosara. I didn't get Kujosara until I had C1 Raiden and already had Yaimiko. She has avoided me since the launch of the game. And so if you're an individual who wants a specific 4-star, maybe you want to buff a specific Overload team, or maybe you want to buff one specific character who you really like, it can be incredibly difficult to get that. And I think a 4-star should reflect that. Not necessarily be better than a 5-star, but be good at their job, and good enough to where you feel comfortable investing into them. If I'm looking at the standard banner here, all of these characters are possibilities. Ignoring the standard ones because nobody ever gets them, there's a pretty high chance you won't get the ones you want. If you're searching for your last Toma, or maybe your last Shinyan, it's incredibly difficult, almost impossible to ever guarantee that, especially if the banners they appear on aren't ones you want to summon on. But for the inherent risk associated with trying to pull for a 4-star, I personally don't believe many of the 4-stars make it worthwhile. Because unless you're somebody who has the ability to pull for a C6 4-star, which is difficult for anyone, then at C0, the vast majority of these newer 4-stars underperform. Maybe they're not good at anything in particular. Maybe they're just side grades. Maybe it's scenarios in which you'd rather have somebody with more utility and versatility. Maybe you'd rather have somebody who offers you more role consolidation rather than just one thing. And yeah, I understand with Dendro units specifically, we're kind of in a position to where their element is already good enough to make them more viable, but at that point they're being carried by the element and not necessarily good without it. An example being, Zhongli is a good character despite being Geo. Take his kit and slide it into any element and he will perform fine, because his kit is inherently good. Whereas Dea is a character who many people consider bad, but her element isn't necessarily affecting anything. It is the kit that is the problem. And so if we're looking at newer units, especially Dendro ones, the element makes them good off the rip. Yao Yao is a perfectly fine character. She's a healer. Good. I don't think many people, including myself, like the fact that she has to remain on field to heal, but she's fine. But for the newer units, for the characters who were released as 4-stars with specific power being locked behind constellations, I don't think that's fair. I don't think locking energy-based constellations behind units C4s or beyond is fair, especially given, once again, how difficult it is to actually pull on them. Because if you like Farazan, you really have an incredibly low chance of ever getting her, especially if you are somebody who's not pulling on a lot of Anemo banners, because she's only featured with either Wanderer and sometimes Xiao. But if you are a Xiao main and already got him, and maybe you don't like Wanderer, then you're kind of in a position to where you have to wait around, and if you see 6, you just cry. Now, I do think Chevreuse represents a good potential point for the 4-stars, in that they can buff specific reactions. Overload, maybe Melt, Vaporize, maybe Superconduct or Electrocharged. But on that same metric, we're also at a point to where I question if those reactions and if those specific teams will be worth running over just the generic Dendro teams. And I do think that's more of a problem with Dendro, wherein it's such a good element with such good reactions that it kind of makes everything else that isn't already extremely nice and extremely easy to use feel worse. But tell me your thoughts. I won't be using Chevreuse because I don't really have a team in which I like and need her, but I do understand she's at least good for the vast majority of you who would use Overload. Maybe you're Yoimiya. Maybe you are Yoimiya main. Maybe you like Fischl. Maybe you just want to run Raiden, Shangling, Bennett, and then have a Chevreuse there, because why not? More options is good, but I just hope these options are worthwhile because we're all spending Primo Gems here. Whether you spent money or saved up, it doesn't matter. Either way, if you found this useful, or maybe just like listening, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.